Thank you. Thank you. When I was first asked to do a TED Talk, I didn't realize just what much an honor it was. I didn't know what a TED Talk was. And it's a generational thing. In my office, the older members of the staff had no idea, and still don't, but the younger generation were very much astounded that I would be chosen to do one. And I think it was my son, my 19-year-old son, when I told him I was going to be doing one, he knew all about them, and he said, "Wow, Dad, that's awesome." 19-year-old sons don't say that to their dads very often. So that's when I began to take it a little serious. I thought, okay, this must be something pretty awesome. So the choice of topic for today is beyond propaganda. This is something which, given my background, I started off as a young student in the College of Art in Toronto, learning to become a marketer, learning how to manipulate consumers. Then I took a little slight career path choice and became a soldier in the Canadian Army and took my commando training. And upon retiring at the age of 26, I started a new career in journalism and started a new magazine. And I've covered war zones ever since then. So, of course, being close to the action, seeing how propaganda is used, and being very much aware of it, it's a choice for today's topic. Now, before we go beyond propaganda, we should at least define what propaganda is. And in its positive form, propaganda can be used and is used during conflicts to keep up morale on the home front, to keep up people's spirits. In a negative context, of course, it can be used to generate conflicts, to create hostility where some might not exist to begin with. So that's a very negative aspect of it. Now, whenever a crisis is developing, of course, the media tend to get on side very quickly. They need to very early on dumb these things down into good versus evil, us versus them. And the media seem to take a willing part in this. They almost feel they got a role to play in wartime. They're going to diminish the defeats and exaggerate the victories and take us all forward like a cheerleader. So there's buzzwords that the media have that they start to insert into various stories early on. Our opponents are deemed to be despots or dictators, or they don't have governments, they have regimes. It's just little subtle words that are put in there. Anyone who's against an authority which we support, say in Afghanistan, they're an insurgent. And they can do no right. These people, there's no redeeming qualities about them whatsoever. That's once it's decided, they're done. They're evil. They're in the them camp. In the us camp, they're lucky because we call them a king or a president. They have administrations. And if someone takes to the streets against an authority that we don't like, they're considered demonstrators or protesters, even if they've got billy clubs, helmets, and sometimes weapons. And this came to the fore in 2011 with the crisis in Libya, because people in Libya took up arms against President Muammar Gaddafi very early on. And then it looked like he was going to get the upper hand. And at that point, because the West was siding with the newfound rebels, they were issued a UN mandate to enforce a no-fly zone. NATO was given this mandate to protect civilians. That was their mandate. Well, NATO didn't want to just protect civilians. They wanted to help oust Muammar Gaddafi. So to do that, to get around that little wiggle room, they came up with the term armed civilians. So the Libyans who were rebels, who had all kinds of weaponry, and some of them were coming in from outside of Libya, were termed to be armed civilians, which then gave NATO the mandate to do whatever they wanted to protect these guys because that's what they were given the thing. So it's a way they can use words and use phrases which makes no sense at all. If you take up weapons in a war, you're a combatant. Other things which are used are phrases that are thrown out there. In other words, anything that's being done or plotted against us to do us harm is a war crime. And a lot of this becomes very disproportionate. And one of the cases I'll use to illustrate that is that of, at the time, in 2002, a young 15-year-old Omar Khadr. Okay? He was an Afghan-Canadian boy. He was in an Afghan village when al-Qaeda came under attack. He was there with them, but they were under attack by American soldiers. During that battle, his brother was killed. He himself was shot 3 times. And when they threw a grenade into the room he was in, he threw the grenade back. And it killed an American soldier and wounded another. He was subsequently taken into captivity. And after 12 years, he confessed to having committed a war crime. Also exaggerated and overused is the phrase weapon of mass destruction. Normally that would be the use of a nuclear bomb, massive use of chemical weapons or a biological agent against an urban population, something huge. Now, to show you how ridiculous that is, the phrase weapon of mass destruction was used when it was Richard Reed, AKA the shoe bomber, back in December 2001. He tried to get 10 ounces of plastic explosive aboard an aircraft in his shoe, in the heels of his shoe. He was stopped. He didn't even have a detonator. They took him into custody, and he's now spending the rest of his life in jail because he pled guilty to possessing a weapon of mass destruction. A little bit of an exaggeration on that for what he actually had. Reverse that when it becomes us. When America wanted to invade Iraq in 2003, they made the false claim that Saddam Hussein possessed actual weapons of mass destruction. They invoked a self-defense claim that they needed to go in. He was going to destroy the world if they didn't, they said, so they invaded Iraq. During the course of that invasion and the subsequent 10-year occupation and the conflict that continued, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, not just by Americans' hands, but by interfactional violence, but hundreds of thousands of Iraqi citizens were killed. Nobody has ever labeled that a war crime. It was collateral damage. We just use a phrase and throw it out there. It doesn't matter what the scale was. No one's been charged with it, the fact that they falsified the claim of weapons of mass destruction. Now, in the very early stages of that campaign, when they went in and attacked Iraq, they launched a huge aerial bombardment of the major cities in Iraq, using real weapons of mass destruction, 500-kilogram bombs on the city, huge explosions, and U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld actually said this was the shock and awe tactic that they were employing. And he said they were doing it deliberately to undermine the will of the Iraqi people to resist once the invasion started. So in other words, it's okay to terrorize civilians as long as it's us doing the terrorizing. Now, the military comes by its propaganda in a very honest fashion because it runs against human nature to take another life. It is not human nature to kill another human being. We have a natural empathy as a species. I think you guys all realize if you see a kid fall off his scooter and scrape his knee, we wince. If we see someone else's blood, sometimes people faint. Every guy in the room knows if he sees a guy take one in the nads, that everybody knows what that might feel like. It doesn't have to be him, we feel his pain. So that, to overcome that, for us to go out there and actually kill, the soldiers are taught in battle school and in boot camp that we need to dehumanize the enemy. Therefore, we don't go to war against people, we go to war against krauts, japs, nips, slopes, gooks. These are all really offensive terms, but they were used in wartime, even used in comic books to get people on side. It was something which was just generally termed, and we accepted that. And we also think now, hearing them as I'm saying them, people are cringing. It's like, well, we want to believe that we're a much more sensitive society now, particularly in Canada, where we're much more open and much more cosmopolitan, that we wouldn't do such things. We wouldn't think of that. Because of the nature of the job, and because people are out trying to do harm to our soldiers in various places, they still have that kind of mentality. And one example I'll give, it also sometimes shows when we come up with these slurs, or they come up with them, quite often indicates just how ignorant we are of the other culture that we're engaging. In 2003, when the Americans went into Iraq, one of the first things they did was they dismantled the security force in Iraq. Every policeman, every traffic cop, every soldier was disarmed and sent on his way. There was no law and order. Everybody was off the streets. There was no utilities operating. I was there at those days. It was the world gone mad. Anarchy descended like crazy, as you can imagine. People started to loot everything that they could find. They were providing for their families by taking from some other family. They're out everywhere. So American soldiers have never been to Iraq. They get there, and their first impression of Iraqi people is that these people are looters, that they're thieves. I mean, they're out on the streets. That's what they're doing. That's all they see. When the mandate finally came for the Americans to move in, and now by this time they had seen that in the center of Baghdad, there's a big statue dedicated to Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. More proof that these people celebrate thievery. So when the Americans would go out and they would detain people at a scene, a crime scene, stop them, they would, through the interpreters, would say, "Are you Ali Baba?" And the Iraqis would happily say, "Yes, yes, you know, Ani Ali Baba, me Ali Baba." And the Americans would handcuff them and take them away, and they were confused as to why they were so willingly admitting to a crime, and the Iraqis were just as puzzled because they know their fable. Ali Baba wasn't the thief, he was the guy that killed the thieves. He was the hero. But because they didn't know that, there was a huge disconnect there. So what was a derogatory term was actually a favorable one. Canadians are guilty of the same in Afghanistan. The term that they use to describe all Afghans is Hajis. I hate to say it, but that's what they call them. Now, they use the term Haji this, Haji that. Where that derives from is when our guys first went out into villages and would meet the locals, they would say, bring forward the head man of the village. And almost every time, he would be introduced as Haji Abdul Wardak or Haji Muhammad Gul or whatever, the first name. So everyone taking notes. Our guys started to believe that everybody in Afghanistan had the first name Haji. Now, they can be forgiven for that, but anybody who understands the Islamic religion knows that the Haji is a title that's bestowed upon someone who has made the Hajj, a pilgrimage to Mecca. So there's very few that ever get to do it, and those that do come home, they're feted by their local villagers, and they're held in high esteem. So our soldiers thought they were using a derogatory term when in fact they were giving everybody an undue title of respect and honor. It would be unfair and unwise for me to stand here and make it seem like it's only the West that is guilty of such prejudices and the ability for propaganda to work upon their ignorance. I am in a very unique position because as a journalist, I ended up spending 5 days as a hostage in Iraq. It wasn't mentioned in the intro. In 2004, I was taken captive by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I was held, I was beaten, I was tortured, and on 5 occasions they took me out to be executed. So when I was released from that, a lot of Canadians, fellow journalists, they said, well, why the hell didn't you just tell them you're Canadian? I said, well, you need to understand that in this remote corner of Iraq where they took me, this is a Turkoman enclave, pretty remote, and their teachings are coming down through their clerics, and they have a hatred for the West that stems back to the Crusades. Their term for me, in first and third person, was the Frank. And we're not talking Frank as a name, it's Frank as in Old French, from when these guys were the part of the Crusaders. So there was a lot of gap in there, but obviously when they teach about the Crusades, we are evil, evil incarnate. And now all of a sudden our guys that are holding me captive hate me, but they have one in captivity. During that period, quite often their hatred would quickly turn to curiosity. My colleague was Turkish and she could speak to them, and they would ask her all kinds of questions like, what does that white ape eat? What does he do? Like, what does he, just simple questions about how does he live? And for them, it was a unique opportunity because up until that point, if you can remember, or you can imagine the pictures of it, the American soldiers that were in Iraq, the only ones they would have seen, other North Americans, were always body armor, helmets, goggles. They looked like the stormtroopers from Star Wars. They essentially dehumanized themselves to the Iraqis. And that made it easier for them to hate them and for them to kill them because they took that apart. Now all of a sudden my captors have got one, he's out of his armor, so it's like a turtle out of his shell, and I'm very much human. So it changed the dynamics quite a bit. Now National Geographic did make a film about that ordeal. It's one of their Locked Up Abroad episodes, and they captured the roller coaster of emotions, what happened as myself and my colleague were transferred from group to group, and we came under attack. And each time we were given to a new group, it started all over again. The person who took us over saw in me, and in one case in particular, he saw the face of the invasion, the Americans. His eyes bored through me. He wanted to kill me. He told me he wanted to kill me. He told me he was going to behead me. And he wanted to. He dug a grave that day. This is an actor playing the part, but it's pretty close. This guy, he really wanted to kill. And at night at sunset, I was to be taken to my grave and to be beheaded. As the sun started to go down, I was in fact marched at gunpoint towards that grave when our previous captors returned. And the guy's name, the leader, was Mubashir. He came, he overrode the executioner. He put a halt to it. There was a long argument. The guy still wanted to kill me, but he was told no. So they decided to all spend that night together in the desert. So the two groups stayed together. We were there. And we had a dinner that night, which they brought a blanket out. And for the first time ever, Mubashir came and sat with me and my colleague. And he had his dinner with us. And Zainab, the girl, the colleague, explained to me that in the teachings of the Quran, if a warrior breaks bread with a fellow warrior, he cannot subsequently take his life. So this was a huge relief for me because this guy was sitting at my table. What was unnerving though was that the executioner, who was still there, did not come and join us. So there was still a gap there. And that night, we only had some metal cots on the desert. We had no blankets, no mattresses, no covering. We were under the stars. And it got very cold, as it does in the desert. And at one point, I woke up with a chill, moved around, tried to pull my coat on and turn my back to the wind, and realized that the executioner was on sentry duty. He got up from his post, came, I pretended I was still asleep, he stood over me. And I knew he was there for a little bit, and then he walked away, and I felt relieved, and then he came back, and he was standing there again, and I felt a weird sensation on my shoulders and down my body, and I realized he'd gone to get me a blanket. And he put a blanket on my colleague as well. So this man who only hours earlier, this is still the same night, wanted to cut my throat off, suddenly he had gotten past that. It is ignorance which breeds fear. He was no longer ignorant. He saw me as a human. And sometimes I got to admit that when we talk about conflicts, is that ignorance is bliss, and that for the military. They can't dwell upon their mistakes. They can't focus on that, and they don't. We were at the Marine Corps Ball last year in Ottawa. This is where all the Marine detachment gets together. They wear their full medals, jarhead haircuts. They're all there. They beam in a videotape from their Marine commandant. And his closing remarks to them was, remember, Marines, you've never lost a battle. You've never lost a war. And they all jumped up and yelled Semper Fi. And I was sitting there thinking, well, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, you're kind of 0 for 3, but why let the truth stand in the way of what you want to believe, right? Now, for Canada, we've also just come through a 12-year engagement in Afghanistan. And we know we didn't win that war. Even the commemoration we had on May 9th was called a Day of Honor because it wasn't a victory parade. And in that conflict, early on, the government seized the agenda. Prime Minister Harper, when we started taking casualties, went there. He said, Canada doesn't cut and run. And then it became a fact that if you don't support the mission, you don't support the troops. Well, that's not exactly true, but nobody wants to be unpatriotic. Nobody wants to disrespect those who serve in harm's way in the name of our country. So the media pretty much self-censored. They didn't challenge the mission. And this is where they failed the soldier, because it's the military's job to accept authority without question. But it's the media's job to question authority without exception. And by not abiding by that principle, the media didn't get it right. Had somebody early on in that conflict said, listen, is it really the best solution in this country, racked by 30 years of inter-civil war and violence, impoverished nation with a largely illiterate workforce, is the solution for us to send in tens of thousands of trained soldiers to train hundreds of thousands of young Afghans how to fire weapons? Because that's what we did. Now, granted, it was a war zone, so we sent the military in and asked them what the solution should be. And the military came up with a military solution. Obviously, we need to create a secure environment before we can move forward. Had we sent in a health official, they might have said, look, these people need to be healthy before we can give them education, before they can learn to build, before they can move on. An engineer would have said, look, we need to build hospitals and schools so we can start to provide health care and teaching, etc. The teacher probably would have said, look, it only rains 3 days a year. We can teach kids under a tree. Let's start educating them so they can then become healthy and learn how to build, etc. We went with the military option. And as a result, to this day, in Afghanistan, soldiers are paid 3 times what teachers are paid. So we actually handicapped the literacy program that we were so keen and so much promoted, because now, to this day still, most young men pick up a gun and are trained how to use it, as opposed to learning how to read and write, or even as the police. The majority of the police recruits are illiterate 16-year-olds. I'm running out of time. In conclusion, we have been, instead of building bridges, we've been building walls and reinforcing those walls with propaganda. Anytime there's a crisis situation developing, the key should be education and dialogue. Instead, we're going a route whereby we close down embassies and expel diplomats, and then we create an information void. Into that void comes propaganda, and that's why we need to get beyond the propaganda. Thanks.